Welcome everybody. We are starting another Ansible Toronto meetup for November 2020, and it's hosted by me, Aaren, and our gracious other hosts, Arctiq by extension. Again, this is another virtual meetup to kind of take place as opposed to what we did before, which was some really entertaining in-person meetups in downtown Toronto. So now we've got all of the internet to, bother with all of our Ansible geekery. And we've got two very interesting guests today to talk about a couple topics. So the most recent Ansible Fest, and also we're going to have some focus in on the Kubernetes and Ansible space. But before we get into those details, as usual, I'm going to get through a couple of the things that have been of interest for the community. So everyone who's not been to one of these, I'm just going to say welcome. For everyone who has, welcome back. And as usual, we've done all of our Q&A via YouTube live chat. So you're probably watching us on YouTube, and you've got a chat window on the right for you to jump in and say whatever you want, frankly. We're not very strongly moderating that stream, but just don't test us. As for any Q&A during the chats, feel free to throw them in. And what'll happen is I'll bring those to the speakers at the end of their talks, and we'll get as many of those questions in as we can. We have a few different channels for getting Q&A to the speakers at the end. You can tweet us, send messages through whatever channels you already have with us at Arctiq. We also have our LinkedIn and Slack if you're in our Slack channels. So a good thanks to Arctiq, Red Hat, StreamYard, and YouTube, without which we couldn't get this done, and the speakers for stepping up today, who you're about to meet. After we go through our notables. So for Ansible 2.9.11 through 2.9.14, nothing incredibly exciting, but we will call out it's great that there's a ton of bug fixes and security fixes in the way, and a few things that are of interest probably to the the more popular range of the community is a number of Kubernetes, VMware, and Ansible test specific fixes and changes. As for anyone running AWX or the equivalent version to Tower 373, we know that already in the past meetups we did mention, you're going to need at least Python 3.6 for the Tower CLI. We've got some performance and scheduling fixes that we've seen some changes in the release notes for. If you're partial to overt collection, such as me, you might be interested to know that the collection's been updated. You've got git python lib update, which no longer causes failed jobs. That's just one of the particular things that I happen to have picked out. And we've got optimized callback receiver for speed of simultaneous runs. And we all know everybody's trying to stretch how many simultaneous playbook runs they can do with Ansible. It's always great to stretch the capabilities of the tool. So notables are pretty short this week, and I guess that's okay. We might even be able to give some time back to everyone today. As for our agenda, we've already dealt with intros and update, and this gives away everyone you're going to see today. So we've got Hart that I'm going to be talking to do a recap of Ansiblefest 2020. We're going to talk a little bit about what we've seen and observed in the ecosystem, and a little bit of Q&A with a little bit of focus on Ansible and networking. And then we're going to bring in the famed Jeff Geerling, who's going to give us a good update on Kubernetes and OpenShift with Ansible, which is something that's always near and dear to our hearts because we live in the Kubernetes space just as much as Ansible on the day-to-day. And then we'll do any other Q&A that we've got left over, closing remarks, and everyone can go and either have breakfast, lunch, or dinner for whatever time zone they're in. So up next, I'm going to bring in Hart. Hey, Hart.
Here.
And we've got essentially a recap of Ansiblefest 2020. So what's going on now is we're just going to kind of chat through a couple of the things that we've seen, and I'll give everyone a reintroduction to Hart. Hart, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yep. So thanks, Aaren. I do have a networking background, as Aaren was mentioning, so a lot of infrastructure experience in the past, these types of things, and now moved more into automation space, Kubernetes, these types of things. So I've been working with networks for quite a few years now, and looking to continue to expand that with Ansible and other automation tools.
Very good. And I'm in a very similar space as Hart in the consulting space at Arctiq, focusing on the open source community, infra as code, cloud tech, and everything that comes in between. But you've already seen me on plenty of the other Ansible Toronto meetups, so I won't get into too much detail there. So some of the things we're going to talk about, Hart, before we get into some of this depth, I wanted to ask sort of, with your focus in your career has being definitely been on infrastructure and networking. What is it that got you into Ansible in the first place?
Well, it was more getting into automation in general, right? They've been provisioning network devices, security devices, topologies, these types of things for so long, but it was very hard to do it in a repeatable fashion, right? So you're constantly, moving configs around, trying to find a relevant config or a relevant blueprint to do some sort of configuration, but it's still very ad hoc, right? You're configuring one thing, you're going to configure another thing. There's no single source or anything like that where you can look back to or update and push to all these devices at the same time. So it was more too many inefficiencies, right? Obviously, room for error, these types of things like that. So looking into some of these tools and workflows to make that a little bit more consistent and reproducible.
Sounds good. And I guess it's been a good journey into automating things in the network space, right?
Yeah, it's been interesting, right? It's nice to have that background of how things interact and how they work under the covers, just as a general baseline for troubleshooting and understanding and architecting things. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of tools out there now to automate network configurations, triaging, reporting, these types of things, right? And obviously, Ansible has been around for quite a while in the networking space. It's continuing to improve over and over, and it's continued to gain more adoption, which is obviously helping here. So
Yeah, for sure. You're definitely not a stranger to doing a number of meetups we've done in the past related to automating the network space, and even just automation infrastructure in general. Um, so what did you get involved with at Ansible Fest this year?
yeah, so it was my first time presenting, so it was a pretty cool experience. Obviously, it was virtual, so it took a little while to get used to that. But all in all, it turned out to be a good experience. Still a lot of good interaction, these types of things. As you mentioned, I was doing a network talk specifically on role-based access control with Tower, interfacing with network devices in the back end, and focusing on multi-vendor, right, to show and highlight how Ansible can interact with different vendor devices through single playbooks, obviously securely, versus having to connect to devices or give out credentials or deal with permissions outside of Tower. And yeah, I covered that off in terms of a GitOps workflow, different levels of permissions within organizations and teams in Tower, and really highlighting the power that brings as a centralized tool, right, to interact with these backend devices and giving different teams different rights, the ability to run different things, see different things, all from that centralized dashboard. And another big thing with around the security side is the credential store, right? So we have the ability to store credentials in there, interact with other secrets management systems outside. But at the end of the day, we no longer have to give different people different sets of credentials, have to worry about rolling them. We can automate all this stuff with Ansible and with Tower.
And I guess if you could break it into a percentage, like how much of that, I mean, we're definitely talking about with Tower a focus towards enterprise, but how much of that do you think we could hand off to like open source Ansible for someone just dipping their toes into it? Like, is it a 50-50, or do you think we can get maybe 75, 80% of it done?
Yeah, I think the open source is important in terms of driving adoption and building content, right? Like we have a lot of collections, we have a lot of roles, we have a lot of playbooks out there for networks now, right? And that's through the sharing of this information, et cetera. On the enterprise side, we're still seeing large enterprises just getting their feet wet on the networking side, right? getting used to using Ansible as a single tool, right? They may be coming from a multi-vendor environment, as I mentioned earlier, and they probably have a whole bunch of tools to manage the network, the security devices, configurations, these types of things. So, one of the big advantages to looking at Ansible for that is, obviously there's a great support from a module perspective. With the introduction of collections, we have a lot of great, pre-developed playbooks now that can be pulled in and used. So even less of a barrier to entry, right? You can pull in existing stuff. It's more about learning a single tool and being able to interact with multiple backends there. So it's really hard to put a number to, open source versus enterprise, but part of the talk was making a case for using Tower, right? Because it provides obviously the UI, the role-based access control, which is pretty critical, right? In terms of divvying up permissions and rights and these types of things. So
I'm just going to take a little bit of a different direction, but how was it getting set up for Ansible, for talking for Ansiblefest 2020 this year and realizing you weren't going to travel, had to set up and do video all from home? Did you get any like special gear sent to you? I've heard of other conferences where if you speak at them, they send you special gear or something like that. Did they prep you in any way? Did they give you marketing do's and don'ts? Like, tell us about some of that.
yeah, definitely no like AV care package or anything like that, but we'll see. Maybe it's still in the mail. Yeah, it was more about, I'd been to the last two Ansible Fests in person, obviously, met a lot of great people, saw a bunch of cool talks, and personally I like to interact that way and present that way. So the virtual system was fairly straightforward, a couple dry runs, and then went through it. And basically what you see if you watch the virtual or register for Ansiblefest and watch any of the sessions, that's the same type of setup we had in terms of recording. So, a presentation or a live demo in one window, and then you speaking in your voice and camera on the other one. So, took a little while to get used to, just with manipulating different slides and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it came out pretty polished. If you haven't registered or seen any of the sessions yet, it came across pretty well. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, I know I'm looking forward, hopefully, to being on in person next year and enjoying that experience again.
Yep, here's hoping. I mean, here's hoping we could distract enough of the geeky community away from the rest of the world to join our meetup today, and what's going on days like today and yesterday. So, it sounds like Ansible Fest was a good thing for you to present at this year. Do you think you're going to submit for something next year?
Yeah, I've submitted in the past, and obviously Arctiq has done a bunch of talks in the past. We did one in San Fran a number of years back, in London as well. So you can find those, on the Ansible sites or through the Google. And that was a lot of kind of networking stuff as well, right? So figuring out use cases for how do I get started with Ansible in the networking world, networking templating, kind of earlier on in some of the networking days with Ansible, right? And that's evolved now to more where we are today with the module support, the declarative support, the resource modules, right? So it's come a long way, but continuing to develop quickly.
You say it's come a long way. So I do remember like it was easily 2 or so years ago where we did some of our first few major events that we did focusing on networking with Ansible, and it was still admittedly a little bit in its infancy, that little bit far back. What was there any? Is there anything major that you think has changed over the past 2 or 3 years in this space that might incite people who looked at it back then and weren't necessarily impressed to maybe give it another look now?
Yeah, some of the stuff I already mentioned. Obviously, the module support has greatly increased, right? We have thousands of network modules now. We have vendors that didn't have anything now have, tens, 20s, sometimes hundreds of modules available. A lot of the modules are idempotent and declarative, and that's come a long way versus you needing to know the language of the backend network device and program it from that perspective, versus now you can say, okay, here's the interfaces that I want, here's an IP address I want, or a VLAN on it, right? And you can declare that in code in a Git repository, right? And then the module can handle whatever interaction it needs to do with the device in terms of applying the configuration, merging the configuration. A lot of the resource modules now, they focus on the concept of state, right? So instead of something like absent or present, like you may be familiar with on the Ansible side, right? You can merge it, you can delete it, you can add to it, these types of things, right? So it's pretty flexible around there, but it provides a little bit more of a as code way to enforce the configuration you want type thing.
Are you saying I don't need to know Cisco iOS or Juniper OS anymore?
Yeah, that's kind of where it's going, right? Early days, you were doing a lot of templating, which means you need to know the configuration layout, the indentation, the different levels in terms of the OS that you need to interact with, these types of things. So while there's still a requirement for that in some fashion, from depending on role and level of administrator, it provides other users or other levels of teams the ability to interact with network devices, or run reports and stuff like that, and gather information about network devices without having to kind of decipher through a configuration. So it provides a more modular way to do updates as well, right? Everything can exist in Git. Obviously with Tower, I believe it was in 3.6 when they introduced the webhook. Right now we can go further down the GitOps approach, right? Like we have looked at already. But even in my demo there, I did a GitOps workflow with network device configurations using GitLab, right? So it's nice to have that integrated. I know some of the events we had done in the past, we were using just a small webhook plugin for Tower to do that, which that was years ago, and it was great because it was something that we could make a GitOps workflow out of. But now this is native to Tower now, so it's a lot easier to use and get started with type thing. So, but yeah, collections, that's been a big thing on the network side, right? Versus trying to find playbooks or curating playbooks from scratch, right? You can pull in a collection now during a playbook run type thing.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff already exists.
Mhm.
You really have to just go find it.
Yeah.
It seems a lot like the focus towards Galaxy has been sort of reinvigorated by the whole shift to collections. I feel like if that had not happened, then a lot of the content would just get lost if you weren't already very familiar with, working with and interacting with Galaxy to get even just your Ansible roles,
Yeah.
right? Which was just playbooks. And now that it's everything, to it's everything, because it's all of the content that would be plugins, modules specific to whatever you're interacting with. Now you do need to rely on getting your collections from somewhere. So it seems like, yeah, Galaxy's been sort of reinvigorated there. Um, you touched on this point several times now already, GitOps. So tell
Mhm.
me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how buzzwordy is it? 10 being it's like DevOps was in denial 5 years ago and now it's a real thing. Like, what do you think about GitOps?
Yeah, it's not specific to networks either, right? You could have even go down the path of maybe saying NetOps, right? But at the end of the day, using source code management as your source of truth for your configs, right? So obviously, webhooks gives you the ability to extend the automation workflow a little bit, right? And the nice thing about using Git platform is you get that approval workflow, right? Merge requests, pull requests, merge to the main branch, these types of things, right? You can trigger on any of these things to say, someone puts, you're now documenting in your code repo, right? You're saying, I want to make this change. Here's my diff. I'm adding an interface, or I'm adding an IP address, or I'm removing this configuration from this network device. And then you have your approval workflow, and it can be executed and kick off a Tower job through the API, right, or through a webhook, right? There's a lot of flexibility to extend that there. So it's a little bit different thinking, because I know like traditional networking is very much interacting with devices directly or through Essential Manager, depending on the vendor. But This kind of takes a whole new approach, and a lot of what we see in terms of Git workflows as well, right? Now bringing the networking into that and getting people comfortable and understanding the process, um, and even with Tower, it makes it a lot more straightforward as well, right? So
Yep. So yeah, as for GitOps being buzzwordy, I can agree that it's definitely a little bit buzzwordy, but it's still I definitely see it as valid. It's kind of the extension of any conversations we've already been having around the concept of infrastructure as code,
yeah,
right? It's got to live somewhere. It's going to live in Git. It's just now we're taking advantage of the tools that you put into things like GitLab and GitHub, where you can do API calls to pull stuff in and out of that, interacting with your code in a dynamic way to make changes to your infrastructure, your network, your storage, whatever have you, right? Um, I think you by now, if you're into this pattern of infrastructure as code or DevOps at all, and you haven't started to realize that you're pretty much starting to do GitOps, you don't need to say that you're doing it um, if you're anti-buzzword, but essentially that's what you're doing at some point. So it's interesting to see, definitely as kind of a trend that we're seeing for sure. Is there any sort of trends that stick out to you lately in the Ansible space in general, aside from I guess the obvious ones, infra as code and GitOps?
yeah, like the network as code is transformed quite a bit, and we're seeing it more often now, right? And it's come a long way, and we could even extend that with some of these other CI tools that we have, right? With around pipelines and a lot of these network resource modules, they have like built-in checks, right? So we could even do a pass or fail on, are we going to apply this configuration to this device based on a runner going out and saying, okay, here's kind of the check of what we're going to execute. Are we going to run this? Is it going to cause a problem? These types of things, right? So we can take it a step further other than, doing a GitOps workflow and applying configuration, right? We want to check to make sure that configuration is not going to cause loss of connectivity or, something along those lines. So we can even build in some more sanity checks around that. Um, yeah, the trends I think is continuing to automate, continuing to share this content piece here, using centralized automation tools such as Ansible and Tower to bring in that like multi-vendor approach, right? Have more agnostic playbooks and modules and these types of things to allow you to interact with something and not have to be an expert in Junos per se or Cisco iOS or Arista or something of that sort. Like it's great to have that networking background and understand kind of what's going on behind the scenes, but there's a little bit of an abstraction here that Ansible and Tower and some of the other integrations here are providing.
I think if you're in this space, especially if you're into even the Kubernetes space and you haven't gotten used to the concept of abstractions, you've got a bit of homework to do. Abstractions continue to be sort of a way that we work with automating all of these things. So it's definitely a common theme. There were a couple other points that I picked out of Ansiblefest this year that I think might be worth chatting about real quick. So some of them um, might be overlapping with each other, and I think it might be worth just chatting about that a bit. And then some of them are kind of an optimization of things we've seen before. So if you've been running Tower for in the community, you previously were working with virtual environments for dealing with specific requirements around using Tower with different needs. So now we've heard of things like execution environments. And from what I understand during the talks is that we're moving to a containerized model for containing the environments, in Tower before they're executed. So what do you think this means for virtual environments versus execution environments?
Yeah, I think the theme at Ansiblefest this year was definitely more of a container native or container focused approach.
Oh, for sure,
Everything
yeah.
everything is going along those lines, and that's kind of a trend we've seen with Tower and with some of the other Red Hat products for a while, right? Um, the nice thing about execution environments, like virtual environments, are very hard to manage across multiple nodes, right? Like if you have tens or hundreds of Tower instances and you have virtual environments, well, those virtual environments are sitting on those instances per se, right? So if you need to make an update, or you need a package, or you need to make a change or add something, you need to do that in a lot of different places.
Yeah, and it's much slower, right? Like it's much easier to spin up a bunch of execution environments as containers, right? In a bunch of instances or even in a Kubernetes cluster as opposed to VMs, right? It's a lot more portable.
Well, yeah, and like obviously Tower has been supported on Kubernetes and OpenShift now for a couple versions at least. I think since 3.3. So and that's continuing to evolve as well. But now we can build specific Ansible versioned images, right? So the advantage to that is we have a very small image or very small footprint with Ansible version X that we need to run in our execution environment, but we can pull that image in from any of our Tower nodes, right? So wherever we're running this from, we can pull that image down as needed. So we only need to update one source, right? We update the image, add a new tag, push it to the registry, right? We can use the automation hub as a registry as well, right? So
Yeah.
there's the integrations continue here. It's more about the end-to-end goal, right, around execution environments. And now they're more portable, they're more flexible. We can pull in our collections fairly easily with Ansible Builder. And it's definitely made it a lot simpler in terms of to manage and update and get on specific packages that you need.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Two other things that came in, and I'm starting to wonder if, the development teams are, talking to each other enough. I'm not putting them down or anything, but we all know like big projects tend to have maybe sometimes some overlapping efforts, but we're familiar already with doing instance groups when you need to have like a separate workhorse Ansible that's guided by the main Ansible tower. So um, we were seeing things about container groups in 3.7 when 3.7 initially released as a feature, and now we're seeing talks about like Ansible Receptor during Ansiblefest this year. And I mean, it sounds like there's a little bit of overlap because it's meant to be able to handle dynamic scaling of Ansible workers, whereas container groups, I was under the impression we're going to do almost the same thing. What do you think?
Yeah, so container groups are nice because it gives us the ability to do execution in a container on a Kubernetes cluster, right? Versus having a traditional instance on a VM that we have to always have running, that we have to have deployed. Obviously, there's still a time and place for instance groups, depending on security requirements, et cetera. But there's a lot more scale to be had with container groups, right? Obviously, instances are finite in terms of how many connections they can handle at once. These types of things, right? So the nice thing is we spin up a container group, we execute what we need to, and we're done from there. And Receptor is more about building out a network mesh around execution endpoints, right? So we don't have a one-to-one relationship per se between the tower control plane and an instance node. We have 10 different ways to connect to this endpoint that's going to execute our job, right? So if path A goes down, this is an intelligent system that can say, okay, now you can get to this endpoint via path B, right? So it's just extending that. It's creating an automation mesh, if you want to call it that, right? But just enhancing kind of the availability and pushing things closer potentially to where they need to be executed versus you don't really want to be executing something on a node in a different location when you have an endpoint that can execute it in that local geography, for example.
So we're talking about something that sounds close to an Ansible mesh. So I think mesh is going to be one of our next pet peeve sort of buzzword things over the next couple of years. We've got service mesh, automation mesh. What's going to be the next mesh? I'm curious.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's hard to say, but just to touch on that point quickly, like we're talking about integrations and other tool sets like that, and now at Ansiblefest they also announced Red Hat Advanced Container or Cluster Management, right? So basically, having a single kind of control management plane for multiple Kubernetes clusters, right? Maybe hard to understand how that actually applies to Ansible, but obviously we're talking about Tower running in Kubernetes, running in OpenShift, right? This is kind of becoming the more de facto way to run Tower because it provides scale, availability, ease of installation, these types of things, right? And I think Jeff's going to talk about it, but also a Tower operator soon from the operator hub to manage the Tower lifecycle, or AWX on OpenShift, right? So it'll handle the backups, the installation, scaling, all these types of stuff. So if anyone's installed Tower and OpenShift today, or Kubernetes, it's playbook based, right? It's very similar to the other installation, the VM installation, but obviously it's a little bit harder to lay down. It's not managed per se, right? So the nice thing about an operator is we can make sure that the way we configure it is the way it's running. So and then container.
Jeff,
Sorry.
if you're listening to this, we won't hold it to you, okay? Don't worry.
And the container management, just touching on how that relates to Ansible, right? Well, think about if you're deploying a new cluster and you wanted to, do some post-installation configuration, right? Which is kind of the bread and butter of Ansible. We've got a cluster online and we want to go lay down this, or we want to, carve out these, namespaces, deploy some applications potentially, or kick off something else, right? Now that ACM can integrate with the Ansible automation platform, we have kind of that continuity in terms of, okay, I have a cluster now, but I can go do some stuff. I can go configure stuff on it, right? I can have workloads running kind of in one workflow type thing. So ACM is going to be cool just for managing any Kubernetes or any OpenShift clusters in general centrally, creating clusters, removing clusters, and just kind of having that centralized visibility. So I think now that the Ansible's, tightly coupled with that, I think we'll see some very cool use cases upcoming in the next little while once it's all available there. So
I think the acronym they chose is a little bit funny. It's RACM.
yeah,
RHACM.
I know you love that one.
Yeah, it's just it's like you got to look at the ecosystem. There's so many tools that are starting to achieve the same thing sometimes, but
Yeah.
that's okay. I mean, that's the nature of open source. You're not out for a legal battle. You're more just trying to get things done, right?
Yeah.
As for Ansible and Kubernetes, I know that you've already gone into that segue quite well. It's definitely becoming one and the same, and I think as the meetup continues to go on, we're going to have more topics about Kubernetes and Ansible together, and so it sounds like today is a great segue into that. But thanks for chatting, Hart. This has been very good and enlightening, and probably very useful for everyone to hear about Ansiblefest if they couldn't make it this year. And just for everyone, in case you didn't make it, or this is the first time you heard about it this year because you thought it was canceled, but you can go back to the Ansiblefest website, and as long as you're registered, you can go and see all the content again on demand. So it's kind of nice.
Yeah, it's all available there.
Mhm.
Keynotes. There's some live Q&As that were done around some of this stuff, and there's a bunch of breakouts with some of these topics we were talking about. So
Yeah, and don't forget Hart's talk too, right?
yeah, have a look. It's there and can replay that anytime. And I'm gonna be putting up a blog as well in the next week or so. So stay tuned for that on the Arctiq.ca site. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the links to our blog is just up there right now. Anyone who's curious. And just I'll take a quick second just to prove that we're live, just to say hi to all those people in the chat who are coming from. We've got Mississauga, Scotland, Toronto. So far, that's it so far. If everyone else would call out where they're coming from, I can mention it if you want, but it's good to see everyone joining us. So now, Hart, I'm going to say see you later for a little bit, and we'll bring you back for some Q&A at the end. And
Sounds good.
Up next, we have a quick chat with Jeff Geerling. Quick or not, he's going to talk to us about Kubernetes and OpenShift for Ansible. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's sunny here too, but it's a little chilly.
Mm-hmm. And where are you?
In St. Louis, right in the middle of the U.S.
Very good. You're in the heart of everything going on.
Yeah. I distracted myself last night by seeing how far I could push the Raspberry Pi with networking. I got 4.15 gigabits through it. So I think
Wow.
I'm going to have to put a pin in it there, though, because I'm hitting the bus limitations now.
Oh goodness. I would be interested to know how that's happened because I can't even get that fast doing LACP on some cheap Dell servers. So I got to look into that for sure. Anyway, so Jeff, I'm going to let you take it away and talk about what you're going to say today.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
So the rest of this episode or meetup, you've talked a lot about some of the things that I'm going to mention. I'll go in a little more depth, but Rackham, which is the Advanced Cluster Manager, is something that I've been working with the team that works on that. The Tower Operator that was mentioned earlier by Hart, it's something that I actually built the first incarnation of it, which was an AWX operator. And I mostly built that because I was working with the Operator SDK team on the Ansible integration, trying to make sure that a lot of stuff was working really well. And the great thing about all this is things have come together really over the past year to make it a lot easier to integrate your Ansible knowledge with your Kubernetes knowledge. And one thing that helps both of them kind of flow into each other is it's all just so much YAML. And if you know YAML, you can get into all these things, and there's a lot of concepts and a lot of ways they work together that are a little more heady and require some more knowledge of the infrastructure and all that. But at least you'll know the YAML well enough to dive in and not get super confused out of the gate or start adding spaces where you don't need spaces, things like that. So,
Jeff, I can't help but jump in and ask, are you tired of YAML yet?
I love YAML. I worked for years with XML and SOAP, and every day I see YAML, I just remember how bad it was back then. So I'm happy with it. Some people are like, oh, YAML is the worst thing ever, and blah blah blah. It's like if you configure your editor to deal with the white space, that's probably the number one issue I see with people is they have white space issues. And if you have a linter, you can integrate it too, and that takes care of like 99% of the complaints I see from people. Being able to comment inside the configuration and being able to write full blocks of text using multi-line and all that, as long as you start learning some of the ins and outs of it, there's so many nice things about it. And every time someone introduces another like YAML 3.0 or some new version of YAML-ish thing that blends things in from XML or JSON or things like that, it's different, but it's not necessarily better. And I think YAML has legs, and it's going to be the kind of the human readable JSON of the next decade. So somebody's going to come up with something amazing someday in the future. But YAML to me is like for configuration what markup is to me for text. My brain doesn't have to spend so much time thinking about it. So anyways, Ansible uses YAML. Everything in Cloud Native uses YAML. So you're already good there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Kubernetes and OpenShift collections. And these slides, I was trying to find a template for it, and the only one I could find was the Ansiblefest one with some Red Hat fonts and things. So this is not an Ansiblefest presentation. This is for the Toronto meetup. And yes, this is live. I am, we've proven that already. And this is live, and it's for the Toronto meetup, not for Ansiblefest. So don't get confused with these slides.
Thanks, Jeff. Hello out to Oakville, Coburg, and more of Toronto.
There you go.
I won't interrupt you again.
No problem. So today, right now, there are two main collections in Ansible that deal with Kubernetes, and these are the things directly in Ansible. So if you install Ansible with pip install Ansible or pip3 install Ansible, you'll get the first one out of the box. The second one is coming in a future update. And I'm going to talk more about why that is and how it's going to happen. But there's two main collections. One is kubernetes.core. And that collection, it exists on Ansible Galaxy. We're transitioning from community.kubernetes to kubernetes.core. And the reason for that is we wanted to use the Kubernetes namespace so that if at some point the Cloud Native Computing Foundation wants to adopt this content, they'll have their own namespace for it, and they can do that. That's the end goal. Is we really want to be part of the Kubernetes community, and we've already done a lot of that. Red Hat itself has done a lot of that by donating the Operator SDK, So many of the different parts of Kubernetes, the ecosystem, have deep integration with Red Hat tools, and Red Hat has so many engineers working on it. So we're always focused on trying to make things the right open source way. And so that's the main reason we're renaming this. The one sad part of that is right now, technically the community.kubernetes collection, which is included in the current version of Ansible, has the largest number of downloads by a long mile on Ansible Galaxy. So we'll have to give that up when we rename it to kubernetes.core. The download count won't transfer over. But we know it's going to be super popular, so I'm sure it'll be downloaded quite a bit. So that's the main collection that has modules like Kate's, the K8s module. It has Kate's info and some other modules I'll talk about. That collection is used for anybody using Kubernetes, no matter what kind of Kubernetes it is. If you're using K3s, like I use a lot on my Pi clusters, or on micro-Kates, or on EKS on Amazon, whatever those things are. But there's also a lot of content that's specific to OpenShift. And traditionally, we were putting that into the main Kubernetes content, but it makes it a little bit more complex, the code of it, and it also doesn't help the people who aren't using OpenShift. So we decided to break that up. And all of that code that's more specific to OpenShift for things like projects and project templates and things like that, and OpenShift inventory and OpenShift auth, which is you can do authentication a little differently than plain Kubernetes. That's all put into this new community.okd collection. And both of these two collections will be supported if you're a Red Hat subscriber. So if you pay Red Hat for support and tooling, and for the Ansible subscription, and get the entire Ansible automation platform and things, you can get support for these two collections. The OpenShift collection is not yet on Ansible's automation hub. It will be, what is today? In a week or so, I think. That's our target, to get all this stuff up. And you'll be able to use it in a supported way. The one complication there is it's going to be called Red Hat.OpenShift if you have a supported plan, but the exact same content will be called community.okd if you're using the version from Galaxy. And you might hear some thumping and things. That's my kids running around right above me in the playroom that's up there. On the YouTube channel, trying to record videos is always a little fun because of that. It's like, stop running for 1 minute, please. So anyways, those two collections, it's the same collection, but if you are moving from, let's say, a project that you were using the community stuff and you moved into a supported area, you'd have to change the fully qualified collection namespace from community.okd to redhat.openshift. Another thing that's gotten a lot of growth and has been very popular, and I think is awesome, is the Operator SDK integration with Ansible. I've been involved in some of the testing and benchmarking and upgrading to the new layout in version 1.0. I'll talk about that in a bit. And also the Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management that was mentioned a little bit earlier. I'll talk a little bit about that too. So some of the biggest things with kubernetes.core, which, as I said, it's currently developed in the community.kubernetes repository on GitHub, but it's moving to kubernetes.core. It's already published as kubernetes.core, but the move is not complete yet. So there's an issue on GitHub if you want to follow that and you're interested. But one of the first things that we did when we migrated the content out of the main Ansible repository was really worked on revamping the tests, because all the tests for all these Kubernetes modules were being done on an old, like an OpenShift 3.2 or some really old OpenShift cluster that didn't have a lot of modern Kubernetes features in it. It wasn't easy to test it. Like if I wanted to do it locally, it took a lot longer. There were a lot of parts of the collection, parts of the modules that weren't really that well tested. And so there were bugs in it and things. So what we did was we used Molecule. And if you haven't used Molecule before, I have a couple blog posts on how to use it. I talk about it in my book, Ansible for DevOps. Molecule is a great way to test Ansible content of any type. And Molecule lets you integrate with whatever system you want to test on. And one of those systems that I test on a lot for Kubernetes content is Kind, which stands for Kubernetes and Docker. So as long as you have Docker installed, you can set up a kind cluster, and it will build a little Docker cluster with one or more nodes, and you can run tests on it. So what we did was we set up a molecule configuration that builds a kind test cluster, and then it runs all these different tests, and we expanded the testing quite a bit. So we solved so many different little bugs that people were having. We fixed a bunch of things that were in Ansible core in 2.8 and 2.9 that people were running into, and we started expanding the module footprint so that there's a lot of new functionality that people really wanted to have. To get this stuff, if you install Ansible 2.10, the current version of Ansible, the community version with pip install. So if you say pip install Ansible, or pip3 in my case, install Ansible, you'll get it as community.kubernetes. It also is included in Ansible 2.9, but not all the latest bug fixes and patches are there. So you should get this kubernetes.core collection from Ansible Galaxy if you want to get all the latest stuff. The best thing about this new collection is we added, the favorite thing that I found in it is the K8s exec module, the second one listed here. That module makes it so that you can run commands on pods using Ansible natively, and you don't have to install kubectl or kube control, as I still call it kube control in my head. I know the community is like, it's kubectl, but it's the same thing as like GIF and GIF. I call it GIF. I don't care what the maintainer of GIF or the creator of GIF says.
Jeff, we're going to have to stop you right there. You can't use the word kubectl on this stream.
Okay, good.
I'm just kidding. You can say
I'll call it kube control then. But anyway, so I installed it, and usually the reason I would install it in my either an Ansible operator or on my servers that were running these Kubernetes automation playbooks is just because I had to run a command on a pod, and it was impossible to do that using Ansible built in. So I would use Ansible with the command module, and it's annoying to do that because then you have an extra step to install a binary on your servers before you can run your playbooks and all that. So this K8s exec module was huge for me. It cleaned up a lot of my playbooks and made it so that my servers had one less dependency and one less thing to update in the background. So that was cool. The other big thing that was added recently was 5 new Helm modules. And Helm, if you don't know much about it, it's kind of the default way that people starting out with, and some people that continue using it, build application kind of packages for Kubernetes. So if you look at Helm Hub, it's kind of like Docker Hub or some other kind of hub where they have, what are they called? Helm charts. I was about to say templates. Helm charts that describe how to deploy almost any kind of standard application into a Kubernetes cluster. So you can add a new chart repository. You can install charts, update charts, check if charts are up to date, get information about Helm charts and deployments, and add Helm plugins, all that with Ansible natively now. There was an old Helm module in like Ansible 2.6 or 7 that was added, but it worked with Helm 2, and it had a lot of problems, and the way that it worked was a little janky, and there weren't many people that were able to maintain it. So these new modules work with Helm version 3 and later, and they're a lot cleaner, and we're still kind of ironing them out a little bit. There's a couple things with authorization that needs to be updated a little bit, but they work really well. And in fact, I have a blog post, which I have a link here, but you can't get to it because you can't click on your screen and get through that. So I'll just say go to opensource.com and you can find this article. It's build a Kubernetes Minecraft server with Ansible's Helm modules. It's a pretty good demo of all the different things that you do with Helm and Ansible and Kubernetes. And it has the full end-to-end experience. You can do this on your own computer right now if you use Minikube and if you install Minecraft and want to play with it. So there's those new modules. There's also K8s log, which lets you inspect logs from pods. I don't typically do that in a playbook because I'm typically doing that for debugging outside of playbook runs. You can also get cluster info now, which is helpful. It's helpful to be able to get cluster information in a playbook a lot of times to see what the cluster is that you're working in, or information about it, versioning and all that. The other major thing that we did with the Kubernetes collection is we pulled out a lot of the community OKD or OpenShift OKD, I forget what that even stands for, Open Kubernetes Distribution or something. But OKD is like the open source name for OpenShift, which is the product. And like I said earlier, the community version that you find on Galaxy is named community.okd. The version that you'd get if you're getting supported usage on Automation Hub is called redhat.openshift, and that's coming in a week or so. We also did a few major things with this. Again, I mentioned earlier that we were testing with an old OpenShift 3.2 cluster, and the test code was kind of it was just not fun, and it wasn't easy to test locally, and we were only testing, a small portion of the functionality. And one of the big changes that we did is now we're using Prow, the system that Kubernetes and OpenShift teams both use for all their testing and integration with GitHub. And every time that there's a pull request or any new functionality or merges, all that code is now run in a fresh, full OpenShift, I think 4.5 or 6, whatever the current version is. It sets up an entire cluster and lets us run this code in that OpenShift cluster. In the past, it was running on OpenShift 3, so any of this new functionality for OpenShift 4, which is now a year or 2 or 3 old, I don't remember how old OpenShift 4 is, it's actually testing it on the latest versions. So that was really helpful to iron out a lot of bugs with newer functionality. And it took out some of the content from the K8s collection that was OpenShift specific, and there's some new modules, and we're also evaluating adding some other modules to help with other things that you might do in OpenShift specifically that might not be possible or you might not do in a normal, like a general Kubernetes environment. So both of those collections can be used when you're building an operator, and you might not have heard of operators before. A lot of people that use Kubernetes haven't. Most people, their exposure to operators in Kubernetes is when I installed Prometheus, it used an operator, and that's about all the exposure they've had. Kubernetes operators are basically a way to put together information about how something runs, and you can put it into an operator, and the operator runs on your cluster, and then you can say, I want like 5 instances of this, or I want to have 1 instance, but when it upgrades, I want the operator to manage all this other stuff for me. So it's like a way to encode the automation in a running application on your cluster that monitors everything that it's associated with. So for example, I manage some Drupal websites, and the Drupal websites, when I deploy them, they need to be installed. So it needs to configure a database, it needs to configure the web container and some storage, then runs the installation. After that's done, if I upgrade the site, it needs to run updates on the site and update the database schema and things like that. So the operator can encode all that in it so that instead of me going in and doing those things manually or having some automation running to do that manually, the operator itself, I can just say, update my code to version 1.2, and it'll do that. It'll do everything for me inside the operator. And there's different levels of automation you can achieve with operators, but the operator SDK makes it possible to build those very easily. And it's really easy, in my opinion, using Ansible. You could build an operator in Go, but that requires you to know Go. And Go's not a hard language to pick up, I would say. It's a lot easier than learning assembly or something like that, but it is a new programming language that you might or might not want to have to learn. But building it in Ansible means you can just use your Ansible tasks and manage resources in Kubernetes that way. Or you can also use Helm, although Helm doesn't allow you to have as much control over the upgrade process or integration with external things. Like, let's say when I update my Drupal site, I also want to call out to an external API and have it do things, and also maybe change some settings in my CDN. Ansible can integrate with all those things pretty easily. And Go, obviously, you could write your own programming to do all that. But Helm makes it would be harder to do a lot of those kind of things if you need a more advanced operator. But there was a problem, and there still is a problem for certain types of usage, in that using Ansible in the operator SDK, Ansible is not like blindingly fast compared to writing pure Go. So if you want to take a really complex operator that does a lot of different things and use Ansible for it, and let's say you manage 100 Drupal websites, And so this one operator is trying to do all these 100 Drupal sites. It can get a little bit slow because the Ansible playbook run might take a little time. So we did a session at Ansiblefest called Fast versus Easy Operators by the Numbers. And we did some benchmarking to find ways to make the Ansible operators faster. And a lot of it involves just the structure of your playbook, whether or not you have fact gathering enabled. It's typically better to disable it in Kubernetes because typically you don't need to know what the servers are that are running because Kubernetes is kind of managing all that stuff for you. So there's a few different things that we found out in there and a few new things that we're going to investigate to try to make Ansible faster, including caching and things like that to make it so that we don't have to create a new Python fork for every single task that we run in a cluster. Since Kubernetes doesn't need that kind of separation that you would use with a SSH connection that Ansible uses. So go check that session out if you want to learn more about the benchmarking we did and making it fast. And check out the operator SDK if you want to manage your applications in Kubernetes more efficiently. There's 100 ways to do this stuff. Operators are one of them. I think in some ways they're one of the best ones. But check it out. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management for Kubernetes, or RACM. And it's a weird acronym. I don't know, but it works. RACM is a lot easier to say than Red Hat Advanced Cluster Management for Kubernetes. But the thing that I helped a little bit with and worked with the teams on is figuring out ways that we can make it so the cluster manager, which can manage one or more clusters, whether they're OpenShift, Kubernetes, or any other types of clusters, making it so that we can integrate Ansible Tower. And when you build a cluster, maybe you want Tower to also set up some firewall rules or change some networking appliances or do something with an app that's still running on some other server and isn't in your Kubernetes environment. And we got a lot of that stuff working. It's a neat integration. And there was a session, I forget what the session title was called, but there was a session talking about RACM at Ansiblefest that you can see after the fact. But I put a note here that I am not an expert on this stuff. I haven't used RACM personally, so I can't answer too many questions about it. Sorry about that, but it's definitely something that if you do need to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters, especially if you're working in the Red Hat environment with OpenShift, it's a pretty neat solution. So that's all I have on Kubernetes and OpenShift content. You can find me online at Geerling Guy, pretty much anywhere online. And I know that there were a couple questions that we'll get into in the question and answer section.
Sounds good, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah, this was very good. I'm glad we were able to have you as a guest on the meetup today. So now we can move into some Q&A and discuss whatever anyone has to ask. I'm also going to reel in Hart because he may have some questions and answers to deal with as well. Hey, Hart. And so there was just a few that came in, some from even our team and some from on the YouTube chat as well. So I'll go through some of them. This one is pointed to Jeff. Molecule and kind, you mentioned that one. And we've seen this even in prior meetups mentioned as well. Do you consider it that it's getting close to being some kind of prod-ready Ansible testing combo? Or does it have some maturity to go through still?
I think it's definitely prod ready in the sense that if you have production Kubernetes stuff that you want to test, it is a good solution for that. As long as there are a lot of different things you can test in Kubernetes, and scalability and what happens when big amounts of traffic come in. Those kind of things are hard to test unless you have a real dedicated cluster running that you can test on. But for anything where it's like the architecture and layout of your pods and deployments and replicas and things like that, kind is mature enough at this point. And it's what Kubernetes developers typically use to develop Kubernetes and resources and things. Kind is really mature, and you can even build a multi-node cluster with kind locally, and it only requires a few gigs of memory. So you can do it in most CI environments too. And unless I really need some features like ingress and IP addresses to assign to services, things like that, like for load balancing. Unless I need those things, I'll typically stick with Kind, and it's been great. It's super fast and super easy. And like I said, it integrates well with Molecule. I also have a couple examples of using Minikube, which is nice for when you need some more of those deeper features. Though Minikube is a lot slower and it's a little bulkier and you can't really run it in CI that well, although there is a way to hack it in there. It's sometimes I'll use that too, but really if your needs are deep enough, Kind and Minikube won't get you there for testing. But for a lot of things, like almost all the Drupal based things that I run in Kubernetes, I test them using Kind, and it's been great. Like I literally have not had a deployment failure yet. And Kind often picks up those little things because I can specify the Kubernetes version and the API works the same, and it's been really helpful.
That just sounds like popular YouTuber good luck, though. The fact that you haven't had a failure yet. I mean,
I've had failures with other things, but not with any deployments from the configurations that I've run through my CI with Kind.
right. I guess speaking of failures, how often do you have to stop Redshirt Jeff from deleting deployments or smashing a Raspberry Pi?
Smashing a Raspberry Pi, it seems like 2 or 3 times a week at least. I have the Pi that was on one of the episodes. You can, well, if it focuses, there it is. You can see over here, he actually got into it before I got to him. So one of these days, he's probably going to blow up one of these Pis. We'll see what happens, but I try to keep him away from, I keep him in the workshop. So there's plenty of things he can get into there without getting into my office and breaking all my electronics.
Got to keep them occupied.
Yeah.
If you're not sure about the background joke, everyone, you'll have to check out Jeff's YouTube channel. As for just a question for both of you to jump into, if you like, this came from our chat as well. Between Kubernetes core and the OKD collections, do either of those collections have the capability to spin up a cluster, or does it only provide ability to inspect or change services, pods, and ingress and such?
Right now, the collections just manage resources in a cluster. So the idea is that you would have created the cluster some other way, whether that's using Terraform on cloud infrastructure, or using Ansible with the right modules to build things, or using tooling that the cloud provider gives you. I maintain a role called Geerling guy.kubernetes, and that role does build a Kubernetes cluster on bare metal using kubeadmin, and there's some other roles that do it too. But it's a tough thing to figure out because there's so many different ways that people build Kubernetes clusters that you can't just say, here's the solution for it. And I know OpenShift has its own installer that's completely separate from all this. So that's something that long-term, I think the community will settle more on some, like these are the 3 main ways to do it instead of here's 300 different ways to do it. But until that time, I don't think we'll be adding it into the main collections. We might at some point. That people have asked for it, so we'll see.
You mentioned Terraform, and I'll spin this to both of you. So starting with Hart, is there any kind of overlap you can speak to about Terraform, Enterprise, and Ansible Tower? Like, what are they achieving that might be different or even the same?
Overlap in terms of functionality? You know what I mean? Like Tower is adding those extra pieces like auditing, logging, role-based access control, visualization, right? And same thing with Terraform Enterprise, right? You're getting that GUI, you're getting, that single centralized control piece, right? So it's from that perspective, that's kind of how those align, right? And we know that, kind of where the sweet spot is for each of them. As Jeff mentioned, like you're standing up infrastructure, Terraform is a good place to start, right? Call Ansible to do the configuration afterwards. And that's kind of a pretty decent workflow if that's what you're looking to do. But yeah, you're extending kind of the open source piece for both with kind of this paid enterprise GUI and additional features and obviously support as well, right? So,
Jeff, anything to add about Terraform versus Ansible? Or?
Nothing really to add. I just know that have seen it seems to be a pretty common pattern. There are people who either do everything in Ansible and accept a little bit of the pain that comes with the provisioning part of it, because Ansible is not meant to be the best provisioning tool in the world. It can do it, and I use it, on some of my smaller infrastructure. I'll use it to build VMs or build AWS resources and things. But typically, using CloudFormation if you're on AWS, or Terraform if you're on AWS or anywhere else, seems to be a little bit more mainstream. And most of the people I see do that, they either use Terraform and then Ansible to configure things, or they use Ansible to build images with Packer or something like that, and then Terraform to bring it all up. So I think that's a totally valid approach. And I don't see Ansible becoming what Terraform is. I see them as two unique tools that can work together really well.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. With Ansible, I think we rely on, that keeping state as part of a Git focused workflow. And while you have the same thing with Terraform, I think I kind of see it as it also has its own state engine, which you have to be concerned with, which is kind of what you bring all together with TFE. Um, but yeah, it's a good topic. I'm glad that question came up too. This one's also for either of you. Does Minecraft belong in Kubernetes?
For me, I ran it on a Raspberry Pi, and it definitely doesn't belong there. there's just not enough CPU and RAM and all that to make it happy. But there are people who make a living off of Minecraft related things, and managing lots of Minecraft servers. Kubernetes is a platform that can do that really easily. So I think in that sense, yes. But I think if you're talking about like your Fortune 500 Kubernetes cluster that's running health patient data, I don't think you'd want to throw Minecraft inside of there.
That sounds like a hint, hint, nudge, nudge to not run Minecraft in a production Kubernetes cluster of any kind. I'm glad we covered that off during the meetup. This is good. There was another one. Can Redshirt Jeff be manifested via API call?
Not yet.
Okay, we got to work on that for sure. I did take the chance to look at your YouTube channel far before the meetup, Jeff, but it was nice to see that you're testing the limits of Raspberry Pis with things like Ansible. And I mean, I have a Raspberry Pi I used for small, home network related things, and I know I could use it as like a mug warmer on my desk. But like, have you ever overheated a Pi doing all the Ansible stuff with any of them?
I have, well, here it is. I've been using this Noctua fan because the only way to reliably keep these things from overheating and throttling is to have a fan on them when you're doing the things I'm doing with them, like running Minecraft servers and stuff like that. But yeah, I haven't had one catch fire yet, and I'm hoping I don't, because you can see behind me I have a sound panel. These are not fireproof, and I usually do all my Pi stuff right next to one, so that would be a bad news.
It's a dangerous line of work you work in. So we got to be careful. We don't want to lose talent in the industry, right? That's all of our questions, and I don't see any more coming in on chat. So it's good to see everyone participating, and we had a pretty good engagement on this one. For everyone who's curious or interested in catching up with us at Arctiq and knowing about Ansible and stuff, you've of course got Ansible.com. Before you ask, how do I get to know Ansible? If you're new to it, please read the docs. I know it sounds like a RTFM comment, but the docs there are actually surprisingly good for getting you started. And as for the things that Arctiq does, our website has a pretty good blog covering a number of these topics, and we have a community code repo within our GitHub org where you can find stuff that we've published. And of course, for Hart's talk and all of Jeff's talks, actually for all the talks that both of them have done in the past, I'm pretty sure they're still available on demand through the Ansiblefest website, and some of them are even on YouTube. And if anyone else has nothing else to say, we're done for this meetup for the day. Sound good, guys?
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah,
Everyone have a great day, and everyone keep safe at home. Bye-bye.
Take care.
See ya.